I'm a 37-year-old guy, and I have a younger brother, Logan, who's 35. We grew up in what you'd call a pretty close-knit family. Our parents weren't rich, but they were careful with money, always planning for the future. They managed to save a good chunk of money over the years, bought a decent house, and were able to put a little something aside for us. My whole life, I always assumed that when the time came, any inheritance would be split equally between us. It just seemed fair. Logan and I have never exactly been close, though. It's not that we fought a lot growing up or anything, it's more like he always knew how to twist situations to his advantage. I'd be the one sticking to the rules, and he'd somehow manage to find a way around them, always walking away unscathed. It's a little hard to explain, but let's just say he's always had a way of bending the truth when it suits him. If he wanted something, he'd make sure he got it, usually without anyone even realizing what he was up to. I always saw it as a quirk of his, something to roll my eyes at, but never anything serious. Things started changing after our parents passed away. My dad passed first, which hit us all hard, but our mom followed less than a year later. Losing both parents in such a short time was tough, and the grief was honestly overwhelming. While I was busy just trying to process it all, it turns out Logan was handling a lot of things behind the scenes. I didn't think much of it at the time. Maybe I was just grateful he was dealing with the logistics, as I wasn't in the right headspace to handle it myself. When the time came for the reading of the will, I wasn't really worried. I assumed that it would all be pretty straightforward, split everything down the middle. That's what my parents had always told us they would do. They were big on fairness, treating both of us equally, so I didn't see any reason why this would be any different. The day of the will reading, I remember sitting across from Logan at the lawyer's office, feeling a strange tension in the room. Logan looked way too calm, almost smug, like he knew something I didn't, and he did. As the lawyer went over the details of the will, it became clear that everything, our parents' house, their savings, every last bit of it, was being left to Logan. Nothing was designated for me. I was shocked, to say the least. I immediately questioned it, of course. I asked the lawyer if this was some kind of mistake, if maybe there was another document that included my share. But the lawyer confirmed that this was the most recent will, signed just 6 months before our mother passed. Logan didn't even try to hide his satisfaction. He just sat there, giving me this look that said, well, what did you expect? He then launched into this whole spiel about how he discussed it with our parents, and they decided it was better for him to handle the estate. He claimed that because he'd been the one taking care of them toward the end, managing their appointments, helping with their bills, they wanted him to have everything. He even made it sound like they thought I was somehow less responsible with money, which, for the record, couldn't be further from the truth. If anything, I've been the saver, the cautious one. The more I thought about it, the less it added up. This wasn't just a small deviation from what they'd promised us our whole lives. It was a complete 180. Our parents were all about fairness. There was no reason they'd suddenly change their minds and decide that everything should go to one of us, especially to Logan, who'd always been known for his, let's say, flexible approach to the truth. It didn't take long for the suspicion to set in. I started asking questions, trying to piece together what had really happened in those final months. That's when a few strange details started to pop up. For one, Logan had been unusually close to our parents right before they passed, offering to help in ways he'd never done before. He'd been scheduling their medical appointments, handling their finances, all things he'd never bothered with until then. At first, I'd thought he was just trying to step up, given the circumstances, but now I wasn't so sure. I talked to the family lawyer about it, who told me that it was, in fact, possible for wills to be revised close to the end, but usually only if someone's pushing for it. The lawyer said it's not uncommon for one sibling to influence the situation if they're closely involved, especially if the parents are in a vulnerable state. It didn't sit right with me. When I brought up my suspicions to Logan, he brushed it off, acting like I was the one being unreasonable. He even had the audacity to imply that I was only after money, which honestly was just rich coming from him. At this point, I knew I couldn't just let it go. This wasn't about the money, it was about fairness, about our parents' wishes being respected. They wouldn't have wanted things this way. So I started digging. I decided to go through old emails, voicemails, anything that could give me a clue about what my parents had intended before Logan swooped in. And that's when I found something interesting, a message from my mom, sent just a few months before her passing, where she mentioned wanting to split everything equally between us. This one email made it clear that something had changed, and it wasn't her or my dad's doing. It was Logan. Update 1. After finding that email from my mom, where she talked about splitting everything equally, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was really wrong with the will. If that email was genuine, and I had no reason to think it wasn't, then the will, which left everything to Logan, didn't line up at all with what she'd planned. I decided I needed a fresh set of eyes on this, so I reached out to a lawyer who specialized in inheritance disputes, hoping for an unbiased opinion. The lawyer told me that cases like this were tricky, but if I could prove undue influence, that someone pressured my parents into changing the will, then there was a chance to get it invalidated. This was my first real sense that I had a path forward, though I knew it would be an uphill battle. But the more I thought about it, the more determined I was to dig up the truth. I started by looking through my parents' financial records. I had access to some old bank statements, and I hoped there might be something in there that would shed light on Logan's involvement. I didn't have to look long. About 3 months before my mom passed, I found a series of transactions where money had been moved from my parents' account into Logan's. Not just small amounts either, these were sizable transfers, enough to raise serious questions. Armed with this new information, I confronted Logan. I wanted to give him a chance to explain, maybe clear things up if there was any reasonable explanation. But as soon as I mentioned the transfers, he became defensive, even angry. He accused me of being ungrateful, throwing around accusations like I was the one trying to tear our family apart over money. He claimed our parents had entrusted him with everything because they knew he'd be responsible with it, unlike me. I could tell he was trying to push me into giving up, but this only strengthened my resolve. I walked away from that conversation knowing that I needed to take this fight further. Around this time, I got an unexpected message from someone I hadn't heard from in years, Logan's ex-girlfriend. She'd heard through mutual friends that I was looking into the will situation, and she told me she had information about Logan that I might find useful. We met up, and she revealed that, during their relationship, Logan had often talked about manipulating our parents. Apparently, he used to pressure them by claiming he was more deserving of the inheritance since he was the one taking care of them. She said that he knew exactly how to play on their emotions, using guilt and responsibility to his advantage. With this new piece of the puzzle, I went back to my lawyer, who agreed that her testimony might be critical if this went to court. He also suggested we start gathering statements from family friends who might have witnessed my parents' intentions firsthand. I started reaching out to old family friends, people who knew my parents well. Some of them were hesitant, not wanting to get involved in a family dispute, but a few agreed to share what they knew. One friend, who had been close to my parents for years, told me that they had always planned for an equal split between me and Logan. She was shocked to hear that everything had gone to Logan, saying she'd been under the impression that our parents wanted things to be fair between us. Another family friend remembered a conversation with my mom, where she mentioned her hopes for Logan and me to have an equal share, to keep us close and united even after they were gone. These conversations helped me realize that I wasn't just imagining things, my parents' intentions had been manipulated somehow. I also contacted their financial advisor, hoping to get more insight into what might have happened with the estate. The advisor was surprised when I told him about the will, and he admitted that, to his knowledge, my parents had always intended an equal split. He agreed to help with my case, confirming that nothing in my parents' behavior had ever suggested they'd favor one of us over the other. As I started putting together all these pieces, word of my investigation spread through the family. Some relatives weren't happy. They believed Logan's version of events, that he had taken care of our parents and was therefore entitled to everything. To them, I was coming across as greedy, someone who just couldn't accept that my brother had earned the inheritance by stepping up when it mattered. It hurt to feel that they were turning against me, but I knew I couldn't back down now. My parents had been clear about their wishes, and I couldn't let Logan get away with twisting their legacy. I shared my story online, needing a place to vent but also hoping for advice. The response was overwhelming. People encouraged me to keep going, reminding me that I was standing up for my parents' true intentions. Many shared stories of similar situations, which helped me feel less alone in this fight. The support kept me grounded, reminding me that this wasn't just about money. It was about honoring my parents' memory and protecting the values they had instilled in us. With all the evidence I'd gathered, my lawyer felt confident enough to start building a formal case. We documented everything: the suspicious bank transfers, the ex-girlfriend's testimony, the financial advisor's statements, and the emails from my mom. Step by step, we were forming a solid argument to challenge Logan's control over the inheritance. The situation with Logan continued to escalate. He tried calling a few family meetings, painting me as the bad guy, and telling everyone that I was tearing the family apart. But I stayed focused on the facts. I wasn't going to let his tactics distract me from the truth. I knew that as long as I kept pushing, the real story would come to light. Update 2. Working closely with my lawyer, I started gathering every shred of evidence we could find. I went through old bank statements, personal emails, and saved voicemails from my parents. We wanted everything we could use to piece together what had actually happened in those last few months. It didn't take long before another family friend reached out. He'd known my parents for years and shared something that immediately caught my attention. Logan had apparently convinced my parents he was deep in debt. According to this friend, Logan had painted himself as struggling financially, saying that he was drowning in bills and needed help just to stay afloat. My parents, naturally, were sympathetic and wanted to help him. Hearing this only made things clearer for me. It seemed like Logan had been setting this up for a while. While combing through the bank statements, I noticed a strange expense that seemed completely out of place. It was a large payment, listed under a vendor's name I didn't recognize, right around the time the will had been changed. My lawyer and I couldn't link this transaction to anything my parents would typically spend money on. That's when my lawyer suggested hiring a forensic accountant. If Logan had manipulated them financially, this expert could help trace any unusual transactions or hidden payments connected to him. We hoped it would give us something concrete to show that Logan had influenced my parents. Word about the investigation must have reached Logan because, out of nowhere, he called a family meeting. He positioned it as a chance for transparency and invited several family members, likely hoping to control the narrative. At the meeting, he tried to paint me as greedy and ungrateful, claiming I was only interested in tearing the family apart for money. He went on and on, trying to convince everyone that he was the responsible one, the dutiful son who had taken care of our parents, while I was simply there to stir up trouble. I didn't back down. I laid out some of the evidence we'd already gathered. I mentioned the email from my mom stating her wish to divide everything equally and brought up the suspicious bank transfers Logan had made before her passing. I could see the shock on some family members' faces. Most of them had no idea what Logan had done behind the scenes. Logan, clearly realizing he was losing control of the conversation, got defensive, his voice getting louder, and then abruptly stormed out. My lawyer later told me that his reaction could actually benefit our case, as it showed he was trying to avoid facing the facts. A few days after that meeting, I found something remarkable while going through more of my parents' papers, a draft of a will from about a year before they passed. This draft outlined a 505050 split of everything between Logan and me. I immediately reached out to the lawyer who had initially drafted that will, hoping he could confirm its authenticity. He not only confirmed it, but also mentioned that my parents had been very clear about wanting everything divided equally. They hadn't shown any indication of favoring one of us over the other. As the investigation went on, more people began reaching out to offer support. An aunt of mine, who had previously kept her distance, contacted me and confessed that she'd always been suspicious of Logan. She'd noticed him getting close to our parents, especially toward the end, and felt he was always angling for something financially. Hearing her side gave me a new sense of determination. Little by little, people were starting to see Logan's true colors. Once the forensic accountant finished analyzing the financial records, he delivered a finding that sealed the deal for us. Not only had Logan taken advantage of my parents' trust, but he'd also manipulated them during their final months, exploiting their deteriorating health and mental state to make himself seem indispensable. This was exactly the kind of evidence we needed to move forward. With everything we'd gathered, the bank transfers, the testimonies from family friends, the draft will, and the accountant's findings, I decided it was time to file the case officially. I was prepared to take all this to court. Logan had gone too far, and I was ready to expose everything he'd done. For the first time in a long time, I felt empowered, knowing I had the evidence and support to bring the truth to light. Update 3. After gathering everything I needed, we finally received the court date. The tension was unreal. I knew this was my one shot to bring the truth to light. Not long before the hearing, Logan contacted me out of nowhere. He tried to offer me a small settlement, enough to make me reconsider, but nowhere near what I knew my parents would have intended. It felt like a last-ditch attempt to make this whole thing go away. I turned him down, and he didn't take it well, accusing me of being out to ruin him. But I wasn't budging. I was there to honor our parents' wishes, not to negotiate with him. When the day of the trial came, I walked in with my lawyer, who had prepared a strong case. We started with the forensic accountant's testimony. He detailed the suspicious transactions in my parents' bank account, showing how funds had been moved to Logan's account without their typical spending patterns. The accountant explained the timeline, noting how these unusual withdrawals aligned closely with the period Logan had started helping our parents and the time frame when the will had been modified. Hearing it all laid out so clearly gave the courtroom a clear picture of Logan's intentions. Next, the lawyer who had drafted the original will, the one with the 5050 split, took the stand. He confirmed that he'd been approached by my parents about a fair division between me and Logan and had no knowledge of any desire to favor one of us over the other. This statement seemed to catch Logan off guard. He hadn't expected a lawyer, a professional voice, to back up my side of the story so effectively. Then came Logan's ex-girlfriend, who had agreed to testify about the manipulation she'd witnessed during their relationship. She described how Logan would often pressure my parents, telling them he was struggling financially and using guilt to make them feel responsible for helping him. She also mentioned how he'd often bragged about getting them to see things his way, implying that he knew how to play them. Her testimony clearly painted a picture of Logan as someone who used emotional manipulation to get what he wanted. One of our family friends also took the stand, recalling a conversation with my mother where she had voiced concerns about Logan's demands. The friend shared how my mother had been worried about the pressure Logan was putting on them, feeling trapped between helping him and keeping things fair between us. It was another piece of the puzzle that supported what I had been saying all along. My lawyer built on each witness's testimony, showing how Logan had preyed on my parents' emotions, pushing them to change the will in his favor through guilt and lies. When it was Logan's turn to speak, he tried to shift the narrative, accusing me of being greedy and only caring about the inheritance. But my lawyer was prepared, countering every claim he made with facts, emails, and financial records. It became clear that Logan was grasping at straws to cover up his actions. By now, the rest of the family had started to realize what was going on. Those who had initially sided with Logan were beginning to see the lengths he'd gone to in order to manipulate our parents. They watched as the forensic accountant went over the bank records again, highlighting exactly where the transfers had happened. Each piece of evidence seemed to break down the image Logan had carefully constructed. I finally presented the email from my mom, which had been one of the first clues that set me on this path. In it, she clearly expressed her wish for an equal division, stating that she wanted to make sure things were fair for both of us. As the judge read through it, I could see Logan getting more and more uncomfortable, realizing that he was losing ground. The judge took in all the evidence seriously, and for the first time I could tell we had a real chance. My lawyer wrapped up our side with a strong closing argument, focusing on family values, fairness, and the importance of honoring the wishes of the deceased. He pointed out that this case wasn't about the money, it was about ensuring my parents' legacy was respected, something Logan had clearly disregarded. As the trial wrapped up and we awaited the judge's decision, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Logan was visibly shaken, his confident demeanor slipping as he realized the depth of evidence stacked against him. I shared this update on Reddit while waiting for the decision, and the outpouring of support was overwhelming. Thousands of people were cheering for justice, sharing similar experiences and urging me to keep going until the end. All that was left was the judge's ruling, and as we sat in that courtroom waiting, I knew I'd done everything I could to stand up for what was right. The journey had been long, but every lie Logan told, every manipulation he'd used was finally out in the open. I could only hope that the judge would see things for what they truly were and make a decision that would honor my parents' wishes. Update 4. The day of the verdict finally arrived. After weeks of testimonies, evidence, and countless late nights preparing, I sat in the courtroom, waiting to hear the judge's decision. When the judge began to read the ruling, it felt like the room had fallen completely silent. The judge stated that, after reviewing the evidence, it was clear that Logan had manipulated our parents into revising the will in his favor. He noted the pattern of financial transfers, the timing of the will changes, and Logan's use of guilt and pressure on our parents. His decision was firm. The original intent of a 50-50 split would be restored, with both Logan and me receiving an equal share. Additionally, Logan was ordered to return the funds he'd taken from our parents' account before their passing. Hearing the judgment felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders. This wasn't just about the money, it was about restoring what my parents had wanted all along. Still, I couldn't ignore the sadness that lingered. My relationship with Logan was destroyed beyond repair, and while I was relieved, I also knew this victory came with a heavy emotional toll. We had gone from brothers to legal adversaries, all because he couldn't respect our parents' wishes. As the court ruling settled in, I noticed that not everyone in the family felt the same relief. Some family members, the ones who had initially believed Logan's side of the story, continued to support him. They saw this as a harsh punishment, claiming that he had only been trying to take care of our parents and that the situation had been blown out of proportion. The family gatherings that once felt comforting now felt tense, with an underlying current of divided loyalties. For the sake of my own peace, I knew I had to step back from these strained relationships. After the court proceedings, I decided to seek therapy. The whole ordeal had left me feeling drained, both mentally and emotionally. Therapy became a way to process everything I'd gone through. The loss, the betrayal, and the mixed feelings that came with the court's decision. I didn't want to carry this bitterness forever. I wanted to let go and move forward in a way that would truly honor my parents' memory. One of the first things I did with my share of the inheritance was to set up a trust in my parents' name. It was something I'd thought about during the case, imagining how I could keep their legacy alive. I funded it with a portion of the inheritance, using it to support causes that mattered to them, like community programs and education initiatives. This trust became a way to turn all the pain of the last year into something positive, a way to make sure their kindness and generosity lived on. I also made the decision to cut off contact with Logan. No matter what had been ruled, no amount of time could make up for what he'd done. He had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and I knew that maintaining any relationship with him would only reopen old wounds. I moved to a new city, determined to start fresh and leave the chaos behind. The distance gave me space to heal, to find my own path without the constant reminders of what had happened. In my new home, I focused on building a life that aligned with the values my parents had instilled in me. I joined a local volunteer group, made new friends, and slowly began to feel like I was reclaiming my life. Every now and then I'd receive messages from old family friends who'd heard about the case. Many reached out just to say they were proud of me for standing up for what was right. Their support meant a lot. It reminded me that people outside the immediate family had seen through the lies and understood the importance of respecting my parents' wishes. Throughout all this, the Reddit community had been my constant support. Sharing each update and reading the comments had been a lifeline, a way to feel validated and not alone in this fight. The messages of encouragement, the advice, and even the shared stories from others who had faced similar struggles kept me going when things seemed bleak. I shared this final update, expressing my gratitude to everyone who had stood by me, both in real life and online. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of people celebrated the victory, seeing it as a testament to resilience and justice. As I read through the comments, I felt a sense of closure. This journey had been painful, but it had also been a lesson in standing up for what's right, even when it feels impossible. My parents had raised me to value integrity and fairness, and in the end, I felt like I'd done everything I could to honor them. With that final post, I felt ready to move forward, leaving the past behind and focusing on the future. The chapter with Logan was closed, but my parents' legacy lived on, both in the trust I'd established in their name and in the life I was building, a life grounded in the values they had taught me, and finally, a life at peace. Update 5. After the court victory, I decided it was time for a real change. I moved to a new city, far from the memories of everything that had happened. I used a portion of the inheritance to buy a modest house, a small place, but one I could make my own. The idea was to honor my parents' memory by living a life grounded in stability and kindness, just like they would have wanted. Moving gave me the chance to reconnect with a few old friends. We'd lost touch over the years, but they welcomed me back without hesitation. Building a new support system felt like the first true step toward healing. For once, I was surrounded by people who didn't know me only through the lens of family drama. They were there just for me, no strings attached. I was grateful for the chance to leave the past behind and start fresh. Despite cutting ties with Logan, I occasionally received messages from him. They were all over the place, some of them apologetic, others angry. One day he'd ask for forgiveness, claiming he missed having a family, and the next he'd accuse me of ruining his life. It was clear he hadn't changed, and I wasn't about to get drawn back into his web. I replied once, a short message to make it clear I was done with the toxicity and wouldn't be engaging with him again. After that, I didn't respond, letting his messages go unanswered. Therapy was also helping, though the sessions brought up a lot I hadn't fully processed. Losing a brother in this way, especially when it had come down to such a messy, public ordeal, left me dealing with layers of grief I hadn't expected. But with each session, I felt like I was making progress, letting go of the guilt and resentment bit by bit. My therapist encouraged me to keep focusing on the future, to build a life that honored my parents' memory without letting the past hold me back. One day, I received a letter from a distant relative I hadn't spoken to in years. This relative shared stories of how Logan had manipulated her family as well, running financial schemes that had left them struggling. It turned out that what I'd gone through wasn't an isolated incident. Logan had been pulling these stunts for years, exploiting family members for his own gain. Hearing this painted a fuller picture of his behavior, and it made sense of a lot of things. It wasn't just me. Logan had a pattern of deceit that went back a long way. Word must have spread, because more relatives began reaching out. Some of them apologized for believing Logan's lies during the inheritance dispute, admitting they'd been taken in by his manipulation. They expressed regret for doubting me and were beginning to see Logan for who he truly was. This felt like a strange kind of vindication. My actions had finally exposed a truth that had been hidden for years, and in a way, I'd broken the cycle of deceit he'd been perpetuating within the family. Meanwhile, I started a new job, which quickly became a much-needed distraction and a source of purpose. It felt good to dive into work, to have a routine that had nothing to do with family conflict. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was rebuilding my life on my own terms, free from the shadows of my past. To keep my parents' memory alive, I joined a local charity organization, focusing on causes they'd been passionate about. I started using part of the inheritance to support community programs, especially those related to education and elderly care. This felt right. It was a way to carry forward their legacy and put their kindness to good use. Being part of something that helped others gave me a renewed sense of purpose, a reason to look forward to each day. One day, an old family friend who'd followed my story reached out, saying he was impressed by my resilience and integrity. He offered to introduce me to his social circle, which included people who shared similar values. Through these connections, I found myself integrating into a new community, surrounded by people who valued authenticity and kindness. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I belonged. With this renewed sense of peace, I decided to share a final update on Reddit. I wanted to thank everyone who had supported me through the ordeal, the strangers who had become a source of strength during the hardest parts of this journey. I reflected on everything that had happened, the painful lessons and the healing that came from standing up for what was right. The comments were heartwarming. People celebrated my resilience and encouraged me to embrace this new chapter, free from the past. As I closed that chapter on Reddit, I felt truly ready to move forward. This journey had been hard, but it had taught me the importance of standing up for what's right, even when the odds seem against you. My parents' legacy was secure, and I knew they would be proud of the life I was building, a life grounded in their values and filled with people who genuinely cared. With that, I left the past behind, focusing on the future with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time.